Okay, guys, we are going to grid our images for our self-portrait. This is obviously not an image of me. This is Emma Watson, the actress. But also just keep in mind that if you hear a bunch of banging in the background, the roofers are still here. They're still working on the roof, so I apologize for any of the distraction that might be, but that is out of my hands. So anyways, what we have here, what I have printed off for you, you're going to have a 4-inch by 6-inch image, okay? So if you're ever wondering, like, how can you kind of start your grid on your own, you need to do just a little bit of simple math beforehand. And I already know how to do this, obviously, but just for simplifying things so you know, because you'll probably be asked about this later. So this is a 4 by 6, okay? What we're going to do on this image is we are going to break this down into a 1-inch grid, okay? So all of our squares are going to be 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch, all right? Now, we are going to enlarge this to a 12 by 18 grid, and that is going to translate into a 3-inch grid, okay? Why is that? Well, because I knew what paper I was going to be drawing on, so I knew I needed to print this off a certain size to fit that. But the math is like if I know I'm going to use this, what is 12 divided by 3 is 4, what is 18 divided by 3 is 6. If I was going to want to make this only twice as large, we're going to be enlarging your portrait up to 3 times bigger, okay? But if I wanted to use a 2-inch grid, I would do 8 times 2, or 4 times 2 is 8, 6 times 2 is 12. If I wanted to use a paper that big, I'd be doing a 2-inch grid, okay? But then again, I did 4 times 3 is 12, 6 times 3 is 18, therefore I'm using a 3-inch grid. Does that make sense? It's just simple math. So usually what I do is I try to keep the image as simple as possible. I knew what the computer already printed out to, what my options was a 4 by 6 or a 5 by 7, an 8 by 10, like those standard picture sizes. And so I knew I already had this. But if you didn't, you could always custom cut your paper to fit. You know, say I wanted to print it at a 5 by 7, and I wanted to make it twice as large, or so that would be 5 times 2 is 10, and 7 times 2 is 14. So I could custom cut my paper to a 10 by 14 if you wanted to. So just try to keep it simple. When you get into, I'm not a math person, so when you get into like an image that has a bunch of funny little fractions behind it, I just round it to the closest number just to make my life easier. So I would suggest that too. So anyways, what we're going to do here is we are going to go ahead and measure. I'm going to get my ruler, make sure your ruler has clear measurements on it. And then I'm going to find my 0 mark, which I'm pretty sure in past videos I might have talked about this. I may not have. But some rulers have a 0 mark on it, and some rulers, the edge is a 0 mark. So you need to know where your 0 mark is. Is it the edge of the ruler, or is it set in a little bit? Whatever is fine, just make sure you know where that 0 mark is, and then you're going to use that to start. So this is my 0 mark on my ruler. I'm going to line my 0 mark up with the edge of the paper, or the edge of the image. And then I'm going to find all my inch marks now. Also, keep in mind that the longest line on your ruler is the inch mark, okay? That not where the number is necessarily. So like this shorter line right here, my number's set off to the side of my inch mark. But some rulers that's set under the inch mark. So you just got to be careful. Make sure you're reading your ruler correctly. So I've got my 0 mark here on the edge. I've got my dots here. And then I'm going to also make sure I'm looking with my eyes directly down at this. I don't want to look at it at an angle, because the slant, when you look at it at an angle, can distort it just a little bit. It can shift the actual spacing off one way or the other. So try to keep your eyes directly down on top of the numbers so you're measuring it correctly. So I'm going to do a mark above the 1 above the 2, just every inch. Remember the long lines. I don't technically need to mark where the 0 and the 4 are because that's where my image ends and begins. So I don't really need to mark there. Now what you do need to do is slide your ruler down and line the 0 mark up on the same side. This being a computer printed image probably wouldn't mess up too much, but sometimes our papers are cut slightly different, so it's just a good habit to get into, just to go, you measure one side, I got my 0 mark off over here, I need to make sure my 0 mark is on the same side here, because it does tend to happen where if you flip your paper around, it can mess up your marks. So again, I went here, found my inch marks, lined it up with 0, make sure I marked right above my inch marks, and I'm looking directly on top of my ruler, down at my paper. I'm not angling it because that can distort my view. So now that I have my top lines marked, or my spacing marks on top and bottom, you're going to draw your lines. You cannot, I can't stress this enough, all of you that think you know better, you cannot just mark one side and then draw, because your spacing will get off at the bottom. Even if your eyes think it's correct, it's not. And it would even be a good idea to measure twice. Double check your measurements before you draw those lines, okay? Because if you don't have a spare image, you might mess up, and then when you go back to try to fix it, you might screw your lines up, erase your picture, or whatever. So it's a similar saying, like if you do construction, measure twice, cut once. You want to do the same thing here. You want to measure twice, draw once. Save yourself some headache. Trust me, it's a good habit to get into. So my printout has this little extra line right there. I'm just going to have to learn how to ignore that. Or if you come across to where your printout's really dark and you can't see your pencil lines, you might have to, you still do it with pencil first just to make sure, and then you can always go over it with a Sharpie or a ballpoint pen, color pencil, something like that. So I've got that like that. Now I'm going to turn, I'm going to follow the same steps. I'm going to line my 0 mark up, and I'm going to move it to where I can look directly down at it. And I'm going to mark my inch marks all the way down. Okay. And then I'm going to slide my ruler down, making sure my 0 mark winds up on the same side as it did on the top. Again, not so much of an issue when you're working on your printed image, but when you have your cut paper, every once in a while, that machine can, the papers shift as they're getting cut, or if you had to hand cut it yourself, it's very possible that you cut it a little off. So get into that habit of just, you know, measuring it and then sliding it down, keeping that 0 mark. That 0 mark is the important part, because if you rotate, it could get off, and I'll show you here in a little bit. So I'm measuring, I'm just double checking my measurements again, making sure I'm good before I draw my lines. And I'm here on the Professional Development Day recording this, so the bell is just kind of ringing in this background. So I'm lining it up. Now sometimes when you guys do this step, people their eyes will play tricks on them a little bit, and they'll think that the spacing's not correct. That is a big reason why you need to measure it twice. If you've measured it twice and your spacing is correct, you just got to trust those measurements. Sometimes your eyes with those parallel lines, especially when like the bottom, when these lines are closer to your view down here and farther away up here, even though it's not much, that little bit of slant in your view can make you think your spacing's wrong. So again, measure stuff twice before you draw your lines. And then if it's correct, then you don't have anything to worry about. You just make sure your rulers line up with your marks, okay? All right, so that is how we draw the grid on our small one. So after we do that, we need to draw the grid on our big one, okay? So I'm going to set this off to the side. I've got this probably is going to be too big for me to get the whole paper in the view, but this is a I've got 18 inches on my long side, and I've got 12 inches on my short side. So it's going to equal out proportionally with the image that we printed, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to follow the same steps I just did. The difference is I'm going to be doing a 3-inch grid instead of a 1-inch grid. But just like I did first, I'm going to line my 0 mark up with the edge of my paper, okay? 0 mark, edge of the paper. Don't let this ruler move around on you. A lot of times, especially if I've got like a metal one like I do today and I don't have that cork board on the back, that cork board kind of helps keep it still. Sometimes I have to stand up and just kind of put my full weight on my ruler so it doesn't move around. Or if you get really good, you can just spread your fingers out and just put some good pressure on there. So 0 mark is lined up on the edge of my paper. I'm going to go and mark above 3. I'm going to mark above 6. I'm going to mark above 9. Let me scoot it down so you guys can see. And if it shifts on you, which it might, it just did for me when I try to move it down, just realign it, not a big deal. So I marked above 9, and I don't need to mark above 12 because that is the edge of my paper, okay? So I am going to slide my ruler down or move, you know, I'm still working on the short side, so I just measured the top side of my short side. Now I'm going to measure the bottom of my short side, okay? Same thing, line the paper up with the 0 mark, okay? If it's the edge of the ruler or if it's set inside like mine is, just make sure it's there. And now I'm going to measure again above the 3-inch mark, the 6-inch mark. If it shifts, just keep it, just readjust it before you make your next mark. 9, and I don't need to above the 12 because that's the edge of my paper. Okay, so now I'm not going to draw my grid yet. I guess I could. I'll go ahead and draw that. It might make it a little bit easier. I'm going to go back to the top though, double check my measurements one more time. I remember I'm looking straight down at my dots instead of at an angle. Especially when you get bigger paper like this, it's easier to, that slant to really screw you up if you're not looking straight down at your paper. All right, so I'm measured that. Okay, so we're definitely good now. I don't really know. Here we go. Okay, so this is, I'm not going to be able to fit the whole thing into screen. I'm going to try to do the best I can, but I've got a long enough ruler here. My ruler is 18 inches long, which is as long as my paper is. So I'm going to make sure my ruler is connected to both my dots. Remember, this is especially where the eyes start to play tricks on you, okay? So make sure your ruler is at both dots. Don't just think it's lined up with one and then the bottom is messed up. That's not the case. It's your eyes. So I'm going to very, very, very lightly, I'm going to hold my pencil back here, and I'm going to very, very lightly drag my pencil along my ruler, okay? I don't want to push too hard because that might cause me to move my ruler. But it definitely will cause me to draw a line that's too dark and then we can't erase it. We want these lines to almost be invisible, okay? So it's really light. It's dark enough to see, but it's going to be light enough where it can erase without a trace, okay? Erase without a trace. I might have to coin that term. But, okay, I'm zooming back out, but you can kind of see how far when I zoom out, it's just, you barely see that line. All right, gonna, again, align my ruler up with both the top and bottom dots, making sure my ruler stays put. I'm gonna put a bunch of weight on my ruler or even stand. Barely drag my line across, connecting at my dots. And then I'll do it one more time for my last one. Okay. Now, if you wound up doing like flipping your paper like this to get your measurements, you might wind up having a crooked line because again, these papers sometimes get cut a little crooked, or if you cut it yourself, you might have cut it a little crooked, which is, again, it's if you have your 0 mark lined up on the same side, then that crooked spacing or the crooked lines won't happen. The spacing will remain the same. But if you flip it, then they might be slightly off. So it's super important that you slide your ruler down instead of flipping your paper. Okay, so now I'm going to come back here and do the long sides. Like if you don't do all 4 sides, you're going to have messed up measurements. Okay, so if you're using just a foot long ruler, when you measure this side, you're going to have to adjust your ruler back, and that's not a big deal, but do make sure 0 mark is on the edge of the paper. Again, I'm going to mark above the 3. I'm looking directly down at my measurements. 6, 9, and if it shifts on you, just get it back. 12. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pretend like I have a foot-long ruler. If that's the case, I'm just going to come back down here. I'll line my 0 mark up with that last mark or something and continue again. So I got 3, and then I wouldn't need to do 6 because that's the edge of the paper. But if I have a long enough ruler, you'll do 3, 6, 9, 12, and 15. Those will be your magic numbers, okay? So now I'm going to slide my ruler down, making sure my 0 mark stays on the same side of the paper as it did on the top. Okay, getting it lined up, looking directly down, lightly drawing 3, 6, 9, 12. If I'm adjusting a ruler again, maybe go back down to your 0 mark, right where you left off, and doing 3 again, or it would be 15 for your last one, okay? So I'm going to go back, I'm going to measure it one more time, double check my measurements, make sure I got it right before I draw my lines, because it is just a pain in the butt to have to do it again. Okay, so those are all good on this side. And they're good. Oh, actually, I might have to adjust one. No, not really. It's the same. My eyes weren't right on top of it, so it looked a little off. Okay, so now that I have that and I've double checked my measurements, I will line my ruler up. Make sure it will line up with both of your dots. There's no way it wouldn't. Even if you think your eyes are playing tricks on you or whatever, there's no way you wouldn't be able to get your ruler to line up. I could set my ruler all the way off crooked like this with this second dot and this first dot. That's going to connect to make a straight line. So if you're thinking they're not lining up, they are. You're just looking at it at an angle. But you definitely still need to make sure you've double checked your measurements. So again, holding my pencil the very back, just very lightly dragging it along the line, along the ruler. And again, standing when you're doing this usually really does help. You can see better. You can put more weight on the ruler with your arm, your upper body, so the ruler doesn't move on you, because that's always irritating when it does. And the last one. There we go. Okay, so I've got my 3-inch boxes here. Okay, they're really big. You should have, you might double count. Like if I bring my image back over, I've got a 1, 2, 3, 4 column here. Now on this one, you would have to do, remember, when we do grids, we want to label both of them the same. Okay, whether you individually number each square, if you do it on the small one, do it on the big one, or you're not going to have a way to make sure you are doing it correctly. So I would do 1 very lightly, 2, 3, 4, and then I'd also have row A, B, C, D, E, and F. And then now 1 and A are going to share the same box, okay? So A, B, C, D, E, and F, okay? So they should measure out to be the same if you've got an extra row in either way, vertically or whatever. If you don't have the same amount, something went wrong, and you need to probably redo it, come ask for help or something, but or rewatch the video again. So after you get that done, or if you're in school, before you start drawing on your big paper, you probably might want to let me double check your measurements. But if you're confident, then go ahead and draw your lines. You probably already have at this point, which is fine. Or after you draw your lines, you want me to check before you start drawing, that's fine too. Even doing a grid first and then having to redo the grid before you start drawing would still save you time, but then starting to draw and then realizing you were wrong. So after you do that, you're going to need to draw, your image. Now, our printers print really dark, okay? So the printout of you, after you draw, you should be able to see it okay enough to get your outline and everything. But when you start shading, because we are doing this in paper or in pencil, you need to erase grid after sketch. After you're done sketching, erase the grid before you shade. Okay? I can't stress that enough. That's kind of out of focus. Goodness grief. So erase grid after sketch, but before you shade. I cannot stress that enough. Okay? Once you shade, like if you have a box here, we didn't talk about this when we did our grill and grid because we didn't shade them. But after, say, you're shading an area and you forget to erase that grid, no matter how pretty it is, if you see that grid line underneath it, that's going to look awful, okay? Using a grid is kind of like the artist's secret. We don't want to advertise that we used it, and the only way to get rid of it after you shade it is probably to erase it. And even if you do that, and I come back in here and try to smooth it out, it's still kind of hard to blend it out. When you erase, it kind of damages the paper slightly, so the finish isn't the same as the unerased parts. So you just have to make sure you erase grid after sketch and before you shade, okay? So, anyways, when you shade, I attached the actual photos for value shading references. So use the actual photos. They'd be in color, but their value is you'll be able to see your highlights and shadows better in the color version than you can on these super dark printouts. So those are on Google Classroom. Make sure you use those as your shading reference versus the printout, because the printout's going to be too dark. Okay, so all right. When you are done, you should get both grids done today, and if you're at home, you'll probably need to send somebody to get your material so that you can do this. And then post a picture.